Hey everybody, this is the instructional video for your balance designs and the Gestalt and Word designs. So the first thing I want to talk about before I tell you some instructions is the type of balance that we're going to be using. Now this was all covered in the lecture. The first design is going to be an asymmetrically balanced design. You can use 2 to 3 geometric shapes and then an organic focal point. When we talk about asymmetry, we just put our divider down the center, whether it's a vertical or a horizontal divider. And you can clearly see in this design that there's more on this side than there is on the left side, but it still feels balanced. So asymmetry is not the same as imbalance, which I showed you some examples of in the lecture. If you have true imbalance, which artists sometimes use, you're going to have actually a feeling of tilting, whereas with asymmetry you still have equal visual weight on either side of your divider, but you feel balance. Often with asymmetry you're going to have a diagonal line kind of like this crossing the axis, but not always. And the weight, there's a lot less on this side, but part of what helps to balance it is that you have the negative space, so you always have to think about your negative space as well. This was a little collage I did as an example. And the next project is going to be the complex repeated shape. Usually a complex shape is made up of simple geometric shapes, but you could use something more organic if you want to. And here we've got the bird repeated. You're going to be doing white on a black background for this one. And again, we've got an asymmetrical design. Put my dividing point in the center. I can see there's more on the right side, but we still feel balanced. Again, you've got kind of a diagonal line moving across the picture plane. Creates a feeling of motion. Here's another example of the repeated shape. Asymmetrical, you can use text in your designs too if you want to. Got the Pink Floyd, and then you've got more visual activity going on the left-hand side, but it still feels balanced by the grid structure. And the repeated shape would be the grid structure. It's not really a complex shape, but still a nice design. I have this one here with the birds being the repeated shape and the tree being the organic focal point. Now this one you could kind of say, it seems a little bit more symmetrical than asymmetrical, but it still works pretty well. Here's another collage I did. I like to switch up the tones, so don't forget, if you're working with collages or whatever you're working with, you can change your background from the 3 tones that we're working with. These two are just going to be 2 tones, the first 2. Again, we've got maybe a little bit more of asymmetrical, but we definitely have more negative space on the right-hand side in this one. So it still has a feeling of asymmetry. If you look at it, you should always turn your designs around and see how they work. I think this one works pretty well this way, because we feel kind of a motion, either going up that way or coming around that way. So this area is a focal point. The next one is going to be your symmetrical design. Now these are really supposed to be 3-tone. They have to be using black, white, and gray. And this one actually has some gray, but it's kind of hard to see. But you can see it's perfectly symmetrically balanced. That's going to be a mirror design. You can either stick with the simple geometric shapes, or you can do something like this, which is representational. I'll leave it up to you. And then your last design is going to be the radial design. And that's where you have a circular design pattern. Part of this was cropped off. And usually with a radial design, wherever I draw my axis, it's going to be pretty much the same on either side. And that could be any of the tones. You could have 1 to 3 tones. And here's a solution a student did for, I believe this was his symmetrical design. We can see if we put the ruler down the center, we have pretty much the same thing on either side. We do have the feeling of radial balance because you got the 2 circular forms on either side of the axis. These are the examples that were in the lecture. Eventually, we're not doing this right now. This was the symmetrical design using the geometric shapes with the central focal point. And eventually we're going to translate that into a triadic color harmony. We'll talk about that later in the semester. So the first thing you should do is do your sketches on your graph paper. Maybe for your sketchbook, you might have a little book like this. These are pretty good for sketching in, because you can map everything out, particularly for the symmetrical designs, and you label what it is so you don't get confused about it. So this one you've got the 3 tones and the mirror symmetry using a vertical axis. I'm looking at it obviously in the portrait mode because it's vertical. If we flip it the other way, it's called landscape. And this was the sketch that I did for the radial design that I did for an example. They're all on another page where I transferred them to. And you can see that I mapped out a square first because I know I'm going to be working with a circle, and then I can use the graph to help me decide where to put things so it looks more perfect that way. So you'd want to do all your sketches for these. Here's another radial one I did. And there are different ways that you can do asymmetry. I'm going to show you some examples, but you do all your little sketching. Don't sketch on the other side. I made that mistake and I ruined some of my other examples here by doing that. If you're using ink, if you're using pencil, you can sketch on both sides of your paper. All right, so we have here are the 3 projects that you're going to be doing for the balanced designs. You can see I sketched these out in pencil on my graph paper, or if you prefer not to use the graph, I recommend using the graph paper definitely for the symmetrical designs, but you could do sketches where you don't really use the grid structure at first and then use that to help you later. So there are different ways that you can do an asymmetrical design. You can have more on one side than the other side. There's the vertical line here. And we can see we've got more on this side, less on that side. Organic focal point here, but it still looks balanced. You can have a triangular form crossing your axis. You can see here I've got these 3 forms. And they kind of form a triangle, and they're well balanced around the axis, so we still feel there's balance. And this becomes the focal point over here. And you're going to have the next design is another way to do a asymmetrical design. And that's when you use your repeated shape, the white on the black background. And here I used the Fibonacci spiral. I drew that in a little sketch and I played around with it, and then I ended up with this. These were all done with marker. And my repeated shape was this leaf flower-like form that I repeated. The spiral becomes the focal point. I've got my symmetrical design with the 3 tones, perfect mirror symmetry, use the grid structure, you just saw that. And then when you're balancing with 3 tones, it's going to be different when you're balancing with just 2 tones. It's going to be harder because the visual weight of the objects will change and vary according to what tones you have in place. And this was the last one, the radial design. You can see I used just simple circles and a very effective, kind of almost like a op art design. Okay, so the way you're going to do that, say you do your little sketches, you map them out, you map out the tones to see what they look like first. And then you're going to use what I call the transfer technique to transfer your designs, which is what I use to transfer them on here. And the way I did that is very simple. If you haven't done this before, you just take your pencil and you take a piece of tracing paper and you put it over your drawing that you want to trace, and then you just trace over everything. If it's something that needs the straight lines, you can use your ruler for that, however you want to do it. And you can see I have these 4 designs I just showed you, and then another symmetrically balanced design. Once you trace over everything, you write right side on it. And how that got a little faded, just so you don't flip it around. If it's mirror symmetry, it probably won't matter that much if you flip it, but for other things it will change the whole feeling of the design and the balance. And you want to make sure that you tape things down when you're tracing them so they don't move around, and then you also tape them down when you transfer them too. Any type of masking tape or drafting tape is good. And this was the design that I did for the symmetrical design using the 3 tones. Okay, so to do the trace transfer, you just need your tracing paper and whatever you're going to transfer. I'm going to demonstrate it with these little mice that I drew for this other drawing of a symmetrical design. I'm going to write right side before I forget, and then I'm just going to trace everything that I want to transfer through. I'm using a 2B pencil. Anything from HB to 2B is okay. You want to have a soft graphite so that it will transfer. Oops, if you make a mistake, don't worry, you can always erase it. And then I've traced everything that I wanted. I'll just get rid of that line because I don't using that. I flip it over to the back, and I just go over everything again. Flip it around. Again, you can see it lightly. I don't know if you can see that on the video, but it did transfer even to the tracing paper. Then I just take my tracing paper. I forgot to tape it down, but make sure you tape it down, especially if you're doing something like a symmetrical design, because if you move it even 1 inch or like a little tiny bit, it really makes a difference in everything. I messed up one of these by doing that without realizing it. So you want to make sure when you're taping it down, you have it in a good position, wherever you want it. If you want it in the center of your paper, that the edges, everything, if it has a grid around it, I recommend drawing a grid if it's a whole design. So you can line that up to the edge of the paper and it'll be straight. And then you just simply draw, again, over whatever you want to transfer through, and the graphite is going to come through lightly. So you have an outline of your drawing. Now, a lot of artists have used techniques like this in the past. In Leonardo, in his portrait of Ginevra da Benci, they discovered by x-raying the painting, it's in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., that he had done an underdrawing by poking holes in his drawing that he made of her, and then taking a bag of charcoal and pushing it through onto the canvas, so he had an underdrawing in the painting that was still there with little dots. When you're done, making sure that you did it on the right side, just lift up and you can see, I hope you can see, that we have the mouse over here transferred lightly, and then I can do my next step, which would be blocking in my tones or my colors. Now, if you want to block in tones or colors, for this one I just kind of eyeballed it, but I recommend if you're not used to working with tones, and we're mostly going to be working in black and white for the first half of the semester, if you're not sure how the balance is going to do, you can actually block in the tones on your tracing paper, or you can do a little quick wash type sketch on paper and see what happens. Now for this one I started out, this is another one I wanted to show you something representational for the symmetrically balanced design, and I started out with a sketch. Just see if I can find it. I know I'm going to lose it now. But anyway, I started out, I wanted to do something that was a little stylized of my cat, my Siamese cat, and I started out with a representational sketch of him, and I can't find the pad that it's on now, which is really annoying me. Right, here it is. Okay, so I started out with a sketch, knowing that I didn't want it to be, completely abstracted. So I did something a little bit more representational, but still stylized. And then I drew onto, I believe, the tracing paper, how I wanted it to look more stylized. And I have done a series of cat paintings I started a while back, and this is going to be the next one that I'm going to do. And I worked from looking at photographs that I had taken of him, because he moves around so fast, as many cats do, that it's almost impossible to draw him and have him sit still for more than like 1 second. And I did the whole thing again. I did several of these, so I have a copy of the drawing. I have the first drawing that I transferred over here. Eventually I'm going to do a color version of that. And I actually did not do a black and white version yet. I'm going to do a collage version where I only use black and white, but I did a color version where I blocked out the tones using the Staedtler watercolor markers. These are pretty good if you want to work with these. I mean, pretty much you can work with what you like, if you like the alcohol markers better or whatever. These are nice because they have a brush tip and a pointed tip, so you can do fine lines and then you can wash in areas of color. Just keep in mind, if you're blocking colors or tones on your tracing paper, they're going to be much lighter, so you should always, than they will be on the paper. So you should always be doing little swatches of all your colors somewhere at the edge or something so you can see, for two reasons. One, because you know the tone is going to shift a little bit when you go to work on the paper, and also sometimes the color does not look like what they actually represent. That's happened to me a few times, so I would check that out ahead of time. And then I added some color in, obviously, but it came out very nice. I don't have the print that I made, unfortunately, right now of the black and white. Let me just see if I can find that, but it came out very nice in the black and white tonal range too, and I'm looking forward to see what happens with the collage as well. And that will be one of the finished ones, and eventually I will be doing an acrylic painting with that. Okay, so there was another one that I did, just to give us a clear background. If you want to do collaging, you're pretty much going to use the same technique. This was another one I did for the repeated shape design. I used another CAD, did all my drawings and sketches. I took the mouse that I had used in the drawing of my kitty, and then I used that as my repeated shape. And then when I looked at it, I didn't have the Swiss cheese there originally. I decided I needed something else, and then I just kind of drew the Swiss cheese and added that in. And I did the same technique. Once I had done the drawing, I don't know where my drawing of the Swiss cheese is anymore. I just took whatever I was putting in the mouse, and if you have something that you're repeating, it's very good because you can keep tracing it onto whatever paper you're going to cut it out of, and you get pretty much the same thing. The same thing with the cat, and then the cheese. I think I just lost that one. Okay, so we can clearly see here that we have more on the right side, but we still have a feeling of balance. It also adds a feeling of motion into it. You've got kind of a diagonal between the cat and the cheese, and the mice are moving around, moving up to that. It almost feels like the cheese is floating, kind of like a surrealistic feeling. The proportions are a little bit askew, so it gives you almost a surrealist feeling as well. Okay, so the next part is going to talk about, just keeping in mind, if you are doing a collage for the balance designs, you can use that same transfer technique. You would just take your drawing on the tracing paper, trace it on the tracing paper, right side, and then you just transfer it onto your construction paper or whatever type of paper you're using, whatever tones you're going to use for that. Okay, so part 2 of this lecture, the instructional video, is going to cover the Gestalt principles and the word descriptions. And for those, you're going to rule out, we've got 10 Gestalt principles: simplicity, similarity, proximity, continuance, closure, containment, figure ground, symmetry and order, area, and emergence. And you can see that I mapped them all together as a little grid of 4. And then I just did all my little designs. This I just did directly in ink. If you want to work in pencil first, you can do that. Again, I'm doing it on a larger piece of graph paper. If you can get the larger graph paper, it's a little more expensive. Actually, it's a lot more expensive. But if you want to work with that, this is great. The Helix is the best one because it has the 1x1 inch boxes. But you can get other versions of that on Amazon. Or if you don't, you want to work with the smaller one, you can work with whatever you have. You just won't be able to fit them all on one page. I was able to fit all of the principles and the word descriptions this way. The only thing you have to watch out for is if you have 2 designs next to each other and the edges are larger covered, then your designs may start to kind of combine together because of all the Gestalt principles. You can use, like the examples in the description, I showed some examples that I had found online. You could just use basic geometric shapes or just circles or just squares if you want to, or you can do a combo of any of those or representational images. And then what you're going to do for the Gestalt principles, and you obviously watch the lecture because that talks about what they are and how to understand what they are. You're going to pick 2 of your Gestalt principles and you're going to blow them up. I did 1x1, so I blew up to 2x2, but you could do 1x1 and then blow up to 4x4 if you want to work a little larger. I did the figure ground. You're going to do 1 in black and white and 1 in color. I did a complement here with red and green. And you can see this is kind of a reversible figure ground. We'll be covering this in another project. We're reversing back and forth between the darker forms looking like the figure and the lighter forms looking like the figure. And the same thing kind of happens with the color version that I did as well. And then I did emergence. Now this was starting out to be a butterfly, and I was thinking of something like that, the idea of you know, the butterfly is emerging and everything, but you can have fun with that. That's a principle that is really something that I read about, and I thought it would be interesting. It's not officially one of the Gestalt principles, but it's the whole idea about Gestalt that first we look at the object and we want to recognize what it is right away. Our brain kind of scans it, and then we say, oh, that's what that is, and then we start looking at all of the details, and that's what emergence is about. And the second part is your word descriptions. You're going to describe these words that I have here. You should be listing everything, you know, what it is, if it's containment, and then you got the 4 like that. So we've got order, tension, increase, congested, bold, and playful. 6 words. You're going to use either simple geometric shapes, just squares, just circles, or little images, or whatever you would like to use. You can add some lines. You can see I did a lot of stippling and lines to get some feeling of texture too. And you're going to be describing all these words. So I did, again, you should do at least 3 to 4 smaller examples of each Gestalt principle in each word description. And then for the word descriptions, then you're going to pick the favorite of each word and blow it up a little larger. You can see these were the ones that I picked. If you feel like doing them in color as well, you can do that. I'll leave that up to you, but you can just do them in black and white as well. And then I just wanted to show you, I have some examples that I had in the lecture. Here's another example of what a student did with the word descriptions. You can see he got very linear and detailed in a lot of his designs, and then did a beautiful drawing technique for those. So if you want to spend more time on them and do something that's a little more representational, I have had some students do that, or you can just stick with just getting the basic idea of the concept and doing it as fast as you can. I prefer to work in the ink. The final version can be on the graph paper, but it should be done in ink. So if you do them in pencil, just keep in mind you're going to have to draw over them again in ink anyway. But you could try sketching them in pencil on sketch paper, you know, and then do them when you're happy. You can then do them in ink on the graph paper. And again, I always do, whenever I'm working with color, I will often use the graph paper for that. I do little swatches of combinations, and for my designs too, I can test out things that's going in that, so I know what's going to happen with my colors. You can do that with the tones too. Okay, so those are the 2 assignments. This is a 2-week module. So first you're going to do your 4 balance designs, and then you're going to do your Gestalt principles and your word descriptions. And you want to hand in all of your sketches. For the Gestalt principles, you can just hand in the small designs and then your enlargements. For the balance collages, you should, and for every other project, you should be handing in your sketches. For the balance collages, again, you're going to do little designs, maybe between 1 to 3, or at least 2. You should do at least 2 to 3, and then pick your favorite one. Now, I want to go over this again because I don't know if I talked about it enough. I just wanted to talk a little bit about this. I think I did, but I just want to reinforce this again. There's a few different ways that you can create an asymmetrical design. It's not the same as imbalance, and you can do it by having more on one side, less on the other side, but it's still balanced. The triangle design, or some type of a spiral like the Fibonacci, which comes back around. It could be a spiral that just crosses over as well, and then you could have something else that's not part of a spiral as well. So keep in mind, and you can look up for other ways or think about other ways. If you look at most 2-dimensional artworks, they use asymmetrical balance. It's not the same as imbalance, which a lot of people confuse. In the Renaissance, you see a lot of symmetry, especially when they would take portraits of people. They always place the person in the center, but they will always have little things to offset the symmetry, usually little elements of asymmetry, so it doesn't become too static. Okay, so that's it. Have fun with this project.